Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to this explainer, where we are going to explore how 6 specific monumental events in history acted as irreversible turning points. We're talking about those crazy moments that accidentally unleashed unstoppable changes, completely rewiring the trajectory of human civilization. It is an incredible story of cause and effect, and I can't wait to share it with you. Here is our roadmap for today. First, knowledge and trade explode. Then, two worlds collide, running on steam, the shattering of empires, and finally, a new world order. Let's get started. Starting with turning point number 1, knowledge and trade explode. Subtitle here, breaking the monopoly on ideas. Picture Europe before the mid-1400s. Knowledge was fiercely guarded, mostly locked away by a highly educated elite within the Catholic Church. Books had to be copied by hand, a grueling process that took months, sometimes even years. But then, a goldsmith in Mainz named Johannes Gutenberg completely disrupted the status quo with an invention called movable type. The scale of this disruption is just mind-blowing. Think about it. Before 1450, you had maybe a few million expensive, handwritten manuscripts across all of Europe. Fast forward just 50 years, and suddenly there are an estimated 20 million in mass-produced printed books. Gutenberg's genius use of a durable metal alloy for the type, combined with a new oil-based ink, literally multiplied the world's written material overnight. And that brings us to an absolutely crucial concept: disseminate. The ability to spread or share information and ideas widely among lots of people. This wasn't just a minor upgrade in reading material. Guys, this was a full-blown revolution. The rapid dissemination of ideas was essentially the 15th century version of a viral post. It dramatically accelerated the Protestant Reformation, letting Martin Luther's challenges spread in weeks instead of years. It fueled the scientific revolution by letting thinkers share their findings across borders. It even standardized the vernacular languages we use today, shaping modern English, French, and German. Now, right as the printing press was firing up, a massive geopolitical shockwave hit. Let's look at the timeline of 1453. Imagine a 19-year-old Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, laying siege to Constantinople. Over just 53 days, he pulled off some incredibly audacious tactics. We're talking physically dragging his ships overland on greased wooden rollers just to bypass a harbor chain. And he employed massive bronze cannons to breach the legendary Theodosian walls. By May 29th, the 1123-year-old Byzantine Empire had completely collapsed. This wasn't just the end of an ancient empire, it was a massive historical accelerant. First off, Greek scholars fleeing the fallen city poured into Italy, which supercharged the Renaissance. But more importantly, the Ottomans now controlled the absolutely crucial Eurasian trade routes. European powers were panicking. They urgently needed new ways to access the wealth of Asia without paying heavy tolls. So the fall of Constantinople essentially forced Europe to look outward, and that directly triggered the Age of Exploration. Which leads us right into our next major turning point. Two worlds collide, the biological collision. So, in 1492, funded by Spain to find a western sea route to Asia, Christopher Columbus made landfall in the Americas. He obviously didn't find Asia, but he did something way more consequential. He violently smashed a biological isolation that had existed between the hemispheres for roughly 12,000 years. We call this unprecedented event the Columbian Exchange. It was the widespread transfer of plants, animals, diseases, peoples, and ideas between the eastern and western hemispheres. This wasn't some simple trade agreement. It was a biological collision that completely remapped the global ecosystem and human demographics. The planet was forever altered. Look at the sheer scale of the exchange across these different categories. From the Eastern Hemisphere, Europe, Asia, Africa, came things like wheat, sugarcane, coffee, horses, and cattle. Meanwhile, the Western Hemisphere gave the rest of the world maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, and tobacco. This literally revolutionized global diets. The potato, for instance, became this hearty staple that sustained European populations through brutal winters. And on the flip side, the introduction of horses to the Americas created entirely new, complex equestrian cultures among indigenous peoples. But we have to talk about the terrifying, devastating, dark side of the Columbian Exchange. I want you to really think about this number for a second. 60 million. That is the estimated indigenous population of the Americas in the year 1492. It was a vast, incredibly diverse, and thriving population. Now instantly contrast that with this figure, 6 million. By 1650, that population had plummeted. Because the Americas had been completely isolated for millennia, indigenous peoples had absolutely zero inherent immunities to introduced Eastern pathogens, things like smallpox, measles, and influenza. Epidemics swept it through with terrifying speed. This 90% drop was a demographic collapse without equal in recorded history, and it made European colonization tragically and terrifyingly easy. Moving right along to turning point number 3, running on steam, the mechanical leap. Up until the 1760s in Britain, humanity was basically stuck under a biological energy ceiling. What I mean is, we could only produce as much as human muscles, animal labor, wind, and flowing water could manage. But notice the massive shift here. Prior to 1760, output was strictly limited by nature. But after 1760, output absolutely exploded because humanity finally broke that ceiling. Thanks to James Watt's improvements to the steam engine, we could suddenly convert burning coal into rotary motion. Machinery could run anywhere, factories no longer had to be built right next to flowing rivers. This was the spark of the Industrial Revolution, mechanizing everything from textiles to iron. But, this mechanical leap came with a massive dual legacy. On one hand, we saw huge urbanization as millions packed up and moved to industrial cities. Railroad infrastructure merged regional economies into a vast global market, and over the long run, it lifted millions out of subsistence poverty. But it also aggressively commodified labor. We're talking about brutal 14-hour factory shifts for workers, including very young children, which eventually forced governments to step in with intense regulations. And crucially, the massive burning of coal initiated the modern climate trajectory we are still grappling with today. That brings us to turning point 4, the shattering of empires, the deadly escalation. So, that incredible industrial power nation spent decades building up, it eventually turned right against them. On June 28, 1914, a 19-year-old with a pistol in Sarajevo provided a tiny spark that landed in a dangerously combustible, heavily industrialized, and heavily armed Europe. Just follow the terrifying speed of this domino effect. Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated. Exactly a month later, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. By August, a rigid system of interlocking military alliances drags Germany, Russia, France, and Britain into the conflict. Because of intense nationalism and these rigid treaties, a local assassination exploded into a massive global war within just 6 weeks. Crazy, right? Now, the powers involved genuinely expected a short, decisive conflict. They thought it would be over in a few months. But the reality? It was a grinding 400-mile trench stalemate on the Western Front. This perfectly captures the horrific futility of industrialized warfare. Armies were equipped with machine guns and heavy artillery, which are perfect for defense, but they had absolutely no way to break through enemy lines. Take the Battle of the Somme, for instance. Over 1 million casualties were suffered there for a mere 7 miles of territorial gain. The total mobilization required to sustain this kind of slaughter fundamentally broke the old world. When the dust finally settled, 4 major empires were completely shattered. The German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires collapsed entirely, and the Russian Empire fell to revolution. New nations were carved out of the wreckage, but the punishing reparations and territorial losses forced on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles seeded this deep resentment and economic devastation. And as we know, that directly set the stage for World War II. And that leads us to our final turning point, a new world order, the accidental collapse. Emerging from the rubble of 2 devastating global conflicts, the world was split by the ultimate physical and ideological barrier, the Iron Curtain, symbolized most famously, of course, by the Berlin Wall. This ushered in the Cold War, the intense ideological and geopolitical competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union from 1945 to 1991. Now, by the 1980s, the Soviet system was really stagnating. Their leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, tried to save it with new reform policies, glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. But instead of saving the system, these reforms actually destabilized it, emboldening citizens all across Eastern Europe to demand real freedom. So the really crucial point here is how this heavily fortified, intimidating system actually came down. It wasn't some grand military strike. On November 9, 1989, an East German spokesman named Günter Schabowski was giving a live press conference. He was handed a note about some travel rule changes. When a reporter asked when East Germans could travel freely, a clearly confused Schabowski replied, "Immediately, without delay." It was a darkly comedic moment. A bureaucrat accidentally ended an entire era on live television. The aftermath of that single miscommunication was just staggering. Enormous crowds rushed the Berlin Wall checkpoints. The unarmed guards, who had absolutely no idea what was going on and lacked explicit orders, simply yielded to the masses. From there, communist governments cascaded into collapse across Eastern Europe, and remarkably, they did it peacefully. Germany officially reunified in October 1990, and the Soviet Union itself formally dissolved in December 1991. This rapid dissolution left our world incredibly interconnected, but also vastly more complicated than anyone could have ever expected. Now, having traced all these historical dominoes together, I have a question for you to actively ponder. Which of these turning points changed the world the most? Was it the printing press democratizing knowledge? The violent but incredibly transformative exchange of biology? The mechanical leap of the steam engine? Or the sudden collapse of global empires? Think about all the evidence we've covered in this explainer today. Let's wrap up with a few key takeaways. History consistently shows us that small sparks constantly create irreversible global ruptures. Human innovation repeatedly outpaces the very systems we build to manage it. Whether they are geographic, biological, or ideological, walls continually fall. It is the unintended consequences of our actions that shape the future trajectory of human civilization. We obviously can't always predict the next domino to fall, but understanding these cascading effects is absolutely vital. So I'll leave you with this. With the rapid rise of things like artificial intelligence and genetic engineering today, what is the next small spark that will irreversibly rupture our modern walls? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you next time.